Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we are diving into a story that is reshaping the balance of power inside Eastern Europe. A story that exposes the hidden pressures building inside Russia and reveals why Belarus has suddenly become one of the most influential players in Moscow's energy security. This situation has shocked analysts, confused ordinary citizens, and raised major questions about Russia's real economic strength. What you are about to hear is a detailed breakdown of how Russia reached a point where Belarus now controls a significant portion of Moscow's gasoline supply, and what this means for the region going forward. For years, Russia was known as one of the world's largest energy giants, a country with immense oil and gas reserves, massive refineries, and a global market presence that shaped geopolitical decisions. But beneath this image of strength, deep structural problems were quietly growing. Aging refineries, sanctions, export priorities, and government mismanagement slowly weakened domestic petroleum production. While the world saw Russia exporting energy to dozens of countries, Russians at home began facing shortages. These shortages weren't sudden. They were the result of long-term neglect and the impact of international restrictions that squeezed Russia's ability to modernize its infrastructure. As Russia struggled to meet internal gasoline demand, Belarus stepped in. A smaller country, often overshadowed by its powerful neighbor, Belarus aggressively expanded its refining capacity in recent years. Equipped with modernized facilities and fewer international pressures, Belarus started producing high-quality gasoline at quantities far beyond its own needs. This created an unusual new reality. Russia, the supposed oil and gas superpower, began quietly depending on Belarus for gasoline imports to stabilize its own market. For Russia, this was embarrassing. For Belarus, it was an unexpected opportunity. This shift created a new power dynamic. Belarus, once seen as economically dependent on Russia, suddenly found itself holding leverage. For the first time in decades, Moscow needed something from Minsk, and not the other way around. This reality is one of the reasons behind Russia's recently tightened political partnership with Belarus. When one country controls the energy lifeline of another, even partially, the relationship changes. Belarus used this fuel advantage to negotiate better trade terms, secure political concessions, and improve its position in regional discussions. Even though Belarus remains a close ally of Russia, it is now operating from a stronger and more confident position. Inside Russia, these gasoline shortages have had major consequences. Prices increased, long queues appeared at stations, and several regions experienced temporary rationing. The government tried to hide these problems by blaming private companies, foreign governments, and even weather conditions. But ordinary citizens knew something was wrong. Russia, the country that sends energy across the world, was running out of fuel for its own people. This contradiction created frustration and opened the door to public criticism, something the government desperately tried to control. Belarus filled the gap by supplying gasoline rapidly and reliably. Moscow relied on these imports to avoid more public anger and economic instability. But relying on another country for essential fuel is never just a business arrangement. It carries political costs. Belarus now had bargaining power that it never had before. This dependence forced Russia to be more cautious, more flexible, and more willing to accommodate Belarusian demands in various sectors. Behind closed doors, negotiations became different. Belarus wasn't just a partner, it was a crucial supplier. The root of this crisis lies in Russia's refinery network. Many of Russia's refineries were built decades ago and have not been sufficiently upgraded due to sanctions and financial constraints. Some of these facilities are outdated, inefficient, or unable to produce modern gasoline standards in high volumes. When global sanctions tightened, Russia struggled to access foreign technology required for upgrades. As a result, breakdowns and reduced output became increasingly common. Every time a refinery halted operations, the pressure on the domestic market intensified. Another cause was Russia's strategy of prioritizing exports over internal stability. Exporting gasoline and other petroleum products brought in valuable foreign revenue. Moscow leaned heavily on these earnings, especially during the economic downturn, but this approach created a dangerous imbalance. Too much energy was sent abroad while internal supplies shrank. For years, the government ignored warnings from analysts. It wasn't until gasoline stations began running dry that authorities realized they had allowed the situation to slip too far. Belarus took advantage of this imbalance with remarkable precision. As Russian production declined, Belarus increased its output and positioned itself as a rescue supplier. This wasn't accidental. Belarus had spent years modernizing its refineries, improving its export capabilities, and securing alternative trade routes. Its government recognized that having strong energy infrastructure could eventually translate into geopolitical influence. When Russia's crisis began, Belarus was perfectly prepared to step in. This dependence also affected Russia's political messaging. For decades, Russia portrayed itself as the stable and dominant force in the region. But the fuel crisis exposed vulnerabilities that the government could not easily hide. Citizens questioned how the country could fight wars, compete globally, and project power when it couldn't maintain enough gasoline for daily life. This skepticism spread quickly online, where people openly criticized the state's priorities. Meanwhile, Belarus's leadership understood the moment. By supplying gasoline to Russia, it earned large profits and strengthened its economic position. But beyond economics, it gained something more valuable: influence. Russia could not afford to damage its relationship with Belarus while relying on its fuel. This changed diplomatic interactions, altered trade negotiations, and reshaped internal power structures between both nations. Belarus found itself in a strategic position that it had never enjoyed before. International observers also took note of this transformation. Western analysts, accustomed to viewing Belarus as a dependent state with limited autonomy, were surprised to see it rise as a critical energy supplier to Russia. Some even argued that Belarus now had more leverage over Russia than many European countries. This shift raised questions about the future of regional security, energy cooperation, and political alliances. Inside Russia, the government began introducing temporary measures to control the crisis. These included export bans, price caps, and emergency regulatory actions. But many of these measures were reactive, short-term, and ineffective. They did little to address the underlying structural problems. When production dropped, the government blamed external enemies. When shortages increased, they blamed market manipulation. Every official explanation avoided admitting the truth. Russia had allowed its fuel infrastructure to deteriorate for far too long. As fuel flowed from Belarus into Russia, logistics networks strained under the pressure. Transport routes were expanded, new contracts were signed, and both countries accelerated coordination. Trains loaded with Belarusian gasoline traveled daily toward major Russian cities. This large-scale movement became so important that it required its own dedicated planning teams. For Belarus, it was a chance to demonstrate reliability. For Russia, it was a lifeline it couldn't afford to lose. Over time, this dependence raised another important question: what happens if Belarus decides to reduce supply? Even the possibility created anxiety in Russian economic circles. If Belarus halted exports, Russia would face immediate shortages, price spikes, and potential unrest. This scenario showed how fragile Russia's domestic energy stability had become. A country with vast natural resources was now vulnerable to the decisions of a smaller neighbor. Belarus's new leverage also shaped military cooperation, economic integration debates, and regional agreements. It didn't need to demand anything directly. Its role as a supplier naturally strengthened its negotiating power. Russia could not risk creating tension with a country that held such importance for its internal stability. This dynamic subtly shifted influence inside the Union structures that Russia once dominated effortlessly. This entire situation also revealed how modern geopolitics is not always determined by military strength or economic size alone. Sometimes the country that controls a specific resource at a critical moment can shape the behavior of much larger nations. Belarus, by controlling the gasoline that Moscow urgently needed, showed how energy supply chains can change political realities. It also demonstrated how countries that invest in resilient infrastructure can gain unexpected advantages. As this crisis developed, many Russians began to ask deeper questions about their country's future. If a nation cannot maintain stable gasoline supplies, what other weaknesses might exist? If it cannot modernize its refineries, can it sustain long-term economic growth? These questions are becoming harder for the government to ignore. The crisis didn't just reveal a temporary shortage, it exposed systemic vulnerabilities. Belarus, meanwhile, continues to strengthen its position. Every shipment of gasoline increases its economic stability, political influence, and regional credibility. It is no longer just a neighbor or a partner. It is a crucial player in Russia's internal energy security. And as long as Russia's refineries remain outdated and sanctions continue to block modernization, Belarus's role will remain essential. The most surprising part of this entire situation is not that Russia faced a fuel crisis, but that it allowed Belarus to gain such significant power over its supply chains. This outcome was avoidable. With proper planning, investment, and balanced export policies, Russia could have maintained a stable domestic market. But years of neglect created a vacuum that Belarus filled with skill and strategy. Looking ahead, the relationship between Russia and Belarus is likely to grow even more complex. Russia may attempt to regain control by upgrading its refineries or reducing imports, but these processes take years. Until then, it remains dependent. Belarus will continue to act confidently, knowing that it holds one of the most important tools in regional politics, energy leverage. This story is a powerful example of how global power structures can shift quietly, unexpectedly, and through something as simple as gasoline supply. It reminds us that even the strongest nations can face internal weaknesses, and even the smallest countries can gain enormous influence when they control something essential. The Russia-Belarus gasoline dynamic is now one of the most important developments in the region, reshaping alliances, strategies, and political realities. And that is the full picture of why Russia is now on the edge, and how Belarus managed to take control over Moscow's gasoline supply at one of the most critical times in its history.